once again, thanks everyone for joining us for the Future of Automation Testing. Really excited about this event. I first learned about karate in my podcast. I don't know if many of you know I have a podcast. It used to be called Test Talks, but it's now the Test Guild Automation Podcast. And I get to interview a bunch of awesome experts. And one of them was Peter Thomas, who is the creator of karate. And so that was in 2017. And then I saw him work on this over and over again, and was really excited to see that they recently got actually invited into the Y Combinator, which is a really cool startup kind of place that a lot of companies come out of Silicon Valley. So really excited to see that they've grown with over 400,000 monthly downloads. And this is not going to be a karate DSL session, but they want us to make this as informal as possible. So it's just going to be more about I'm going to ask a question, and if you have any follow-ups, let me know. I want to make it as interactive as possible. So hopefully that sounds good for you all. All right, so let's get into it. We have our awesome experts. We have Anthony, we have Prashant, Sneha, and Eric. So I thought we'd start off just a quick, easy question. Maybe go around the room and introduce yourselves. Let's start with you.
Sure, yeah, Anthony. So I'm here in an individual capacity. I'll give a sales pitch. I'm really here because I'm a passionate user of karate DSL. So Peter and Kapil have invited me to be here.
Nice.
I've hounded them over the years with questions around karate. So I think just by virtue of doing that, here's the payoff. But I've been in some way, shape, or form involved with quality assurance for a little over 20 years now. Only recently as an automation engineer. And again, I have karate DSL to thank for that. So, I'll keep rambling.
Yeah,
so I'm gonna.
Sure.
Do you have your own microphone? No, we're sharing.
Well,
okay.
That's okay. Hey guys, my name is Prashant Patil. I work in Dell Technologies, and from last almost 13 years, architecting solutions for automation teams and DevOps team now. And we started, at least in my organization, started using karate around 3.5 years back. And it has been a tool of choice for all the API testing, functional testing, performance testing, and UI automation. So that's pretty much about me.
Hello everyone, I'm Sneha Viswalingam. I'm Director of Core Engineering at EvoFi. I started my career with test automation and then moved on to software operations. I worked in different industries like computer networking, insurance, medical device, and right now I'm in the e-learning platform sector. And I am not a Karate Labs user. So I'm probably the only one over here who's not used Karate Labs because this was going to be a more agnostic kind of a talk. So I'm happy to be here.
Awesome.
Hi, I'm Eric Driggs. I'm a principal software engineer at Hulu, now Disney Streaming. And I've been using Karate for about 6 years to solve backend payment API verification. Making sure that we ship software without breaking prod as much. At least don't break prod twice.
Yeah, absolutely. So a great point. They all work for great companies, but they're here as individuals. So anything they say, don't hold them against their company. It's just a legal disclaimer there. So very cool. So this is called the Future of Testing. I know how many of you saw a recent survey that says 90% of companies are actually doing automation, which I was kind of surprised by. How many of you are all doing automation? Is everyone? It's about 90%. So another thing that came out of it was that not only is it 90%, but a large majority of them actually struggle with automation, which is kind of hard to get over. So I just wanted to ask the experts really quickly, how can you do better with automation? Maybe some tips you can take away that maybe made their test more stable. So let's start at the far end this way and work our way back down. So Eric.
Yeah, I think the most underestimated part in all testing is naming. Even just using BDD for your naming. For example, given a user with a free trial subscription, when they try to sign up within 12 months, then they shouldn't be re-eligible. It's an example of a good name. And if we name our tests right, then we know when it fails how to fix it. If you just have, test API call, I don't know how to maintain that. And so the most difficult part is maintaining, and the easiest way to maintain code is to give it good names.
So what do you think of atomic testing? A lot of times people will name something like patient registration, and it'll be like 50 steps, and when one fails, they don't know how it fails. So do you make your tests also more atomic?
Yeah, having smaller tests is definitely better. Don't try to do everything in one test. And if you have a clear definition of the operation of your test, if you have a when and a then that are short and to the point, then it's going to be really hard to have those test everything in one test because you can't name it that and not be a liar.
Absolutely. Yeah, great point. Sneha?
I would say having a strategy for your automation is probably very, very important because most of the time people just think they have to automate everything and end up just automating everything without having a plan on what exactly is needed to be automated because not everything needs to be automated.
Great point.
Right. She stole my point, but I'm going to probably go on similar lines. I think mindset is one thing, right? I think exactly what she brought up, like automate everything. But I think we have a lot of product knowledge testers, right, who has been doing a lot of manual testing, and I think they have great knowledge. I think we need to empower them to see how they can use automation, leverage automation, basically, right? Automation is just putting all sequences in one script and that's it, right? That's one thing. And the second thing is that worked for us is definitely keeping the test self-contained. That means that the test is independent of another test so that if there is an issue, we exactly know where to look for at least, right? It's not like this depends on that one and then there's a lot of chain of tests like that. So,
Great point. How do you get that way? A lot of times people forget about running tests and parallelization. So they run a test, runs fine, then they run it, they spin it up in their multiple containers and has dependencies all over the place. How do you handle that?
So that's the reason I said that I think from data creation, from test data creation, everything needs to be self-contained within that test.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the reasons also we chose Karate because it has the ability to do a lot of things like common tasks can be done ahead of before every scenario so that or before every test so we can use it effectively.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I think maybe combining some of the elements of what all of you guys said, I remember when my career was getting started, everything was manual, and there's obvious drawbacks to that. It's flaky. You could fat finger something, overlook something using your own eyeballs, blah, blah, blah. It's time consuming. But I don't think we ever at a time were trying to hire a QA engineer and thinking, I need somebody with a strong development background. That's not what it was all about. It was somebody who could speak both the business and the system side languages, understand what the customer value is behind what it is that we're releasing to production. And ask the right questions, especially early on. And again, I'm going back like 20 years here. It was tough to get a seat at the table as a QA engineer early on in a project because you just weren't taken seriously. QA time was a crumple zone, essentially, before you get to production. And if the software developers needed more time to get something released, so be it. We gave 4 weeks to the QA guy, but he probably can get away with 3. So it was more about pushing back, understanding that customer value, and zooming in on that and not so much worrying about automating everything. I would say what the tools that are available today to an automation engineer, what they allow you to do is sort of forget about that development aspect of your job and focus on what you do best, which is ensure there's quality in the products that you're releasing to production. Go ahead.
Do you see a trend where a lot of test automation is outsourced overseas and that there really isn't a lot of domain expertise?
Yeah, absolutely. That just goes hand in hand with it. It's sort of thrown over the fence and assumed that they'll know exactly what they're looking at here. They'll find all the problems, and if they don't, well, then it's a blame game. Oh, well, that guy who I never met before overseas screwed up. And that's just not a good way to go about releasing software. Go ahead.
Follow up to that, when you're throwing it over the wall to an outside company, an outside country as well, what type of oversight are you having internally to make sure that those tests are not only correct, but also maintainable?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say in practice, oftentimes it's terrible. Even though, you talk to some vice president in charge of the whole operation, they tell you it's running perfectly. But no, I mean, it's absolutely a great point. Time zone differences, right? If somebody has a question and it's a showstopper, I can't move forward without the answer to this, and the guy to answer it is in a 12-hour different time zone. It's a challenge. So I think ways that I've gone about tackling that is just asking people to every so often work an odd shift just to make sure that you're available. And it's not necessarily going to be face-to-face with that time zone difference, but just getting on a Teams call or Slack or what have you, and just being available at least for, an hour and a half, 2 hours a day overlap every now and then. to make sure that everyone's up to speed, everyone knows what the requirements are, what they're working towards. That's usually, I think when you run into issues, it usually dials back to everyone knew exactly what the requirements were, but then you ask them in isolation and they give you a completely different picture of what they're painting. You have another question? Keep it going.
It's a follow-up, basically.
Sure.
And I've been in this situation, okay? So I understand what I'm talking about. At what point in time is the cost to oversee the outsourcing costing more than actually onboarding and having local grown talent?
Yeah, I don't think.
I hear a lot of yeses or obviously I'm not the only one.
If anyone wants
Everyone
to
else is furious.
I can keep going all day.
I can add to a point where I think one of the things that can help is actually having time dedicated to code reviews. For someone maybe within the company who can take a look at it before really merging it in.
But you're still taking that person's time away from their development by overseeing what somebody else is doing.
Yes, but that's the nature of software, right? Like, we need someone to do code reviews and make sure that there was no oversight, which could have happened even from someone within the company, not just the contractors.
I'd argue that the only model I've seen work well is embedding software quality engineers, preferably full-time or contract to hire. Even contractors is difficult because most companies will have a policy where contractors are only there for a couple months. And so, you onboard somebody for 4 months and then you're just throwing that money away. So it's best, there's a 5 or 10x difference between the best and just good enough. So why not get your money?
So you mentioned testing strategies earlier, and so could you do you have a couple of examples of like high-level strategies of what seems to be most effective or most cost-effective instead of automating everything? Like in big government, I feel like it's encouraged like 10,000 tests are better than 100.
So risk, how does someone handle that? Because that's a common theme. They have thousands of tests. Oh, we're fine, we have 10,000 tests, but they're not adding any value.
So, okay, you want
You can go ahead.
All right. I think APMs are really undervalued as a tool for it. So let's say you've got Datadog, New Relic, some APM, and it's looking at production traffic. You're going to find that probably half of your endpoints aren't even being hit. And of that, 80% of your traffic is going to 2 to 5 endpoints. And so you can use the combination of look at your non-prod, look at your prod traffic over a period of about a week. And you can use that in conjunction with your developers. So you need to have a test plan that's based upon the use cases that the developers know, because they're the domain experts, as well as you can just use the actual traffic and use that to prioritize, because you have such a finite amount of time. You only want to have the tests that are going to add actual value.
Yeah, that, and also I think a lot of code coverage tools that help you see, if you have enough tests that's covering all of the code instead of just going on adding tests that's for code that's already been covered, and also risk-based test plans and assessment to make sure that you're covering all the things that's actually needed to be tested instead of the low traffic ones.
I'll just add one point to all this, right? I think a lot of time we miss communication, and I think when you get tasked or a team of people to get tasked to automate something, generally it happens that they go in silos and they automate everything or whatever needs to be automated, right? I think the strategy needs to be where we have a test design session. Just treat the test as a product development. I think if you follow all the principles of those, I think you will have a successful testing, code and the automation project, everything. So,
yeah, I think it's really easy to have. I think too many tests is often much worse than too little.
Yeah.
And I think that gets back to Joe's point earlier of not throwing too much in the same test. If you're asserting every service, then your test is wrong.
And also, I would think it would kill the team's confidence in your tests. If you have a lot of tests that aren't adding any value, they're failing, and they start ignoring them.
Yeah.
So less is better.
It's cry wolf, really quick.
Absolutely.
Oh, and I just wanted to add that, testing 10,000 tests and getting those 10,000 results means that someone has to look at those results,
Yeah.
which costs a lot.
Yep.
Probably will just bog you down. So.
It's really fun to do, though, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that,
Okay, to Eric's point earlier, software development works a lot better when the test automation is being done in conjunction with the development teams, when you've got an embedded engineer. One of the common problems I've faced throughout my career is the problem that the automated test results are seen as unreliable and are not paid attention to, consequently, by the development team. What can be done to, one, keep the test results reliable, and two, to actually have developers' eyes on those tests and have failing tests be taken seriously and result in code changes to fix them, to keep these tests providing value moving forward?
I personally think, I don't know if you found this as well, is they're trying to say run less tests. I think you should run less tests as well. I think there's a gap here between run all your tests all the time and every build, something fails. Does it have anything to do with the check-in? I don't know. So people they don't pay attention to it. But if you had a way to map it that when code A is checked in, that you need to run test Z and B, then if those fail, I think you'd have more confidence in it. So I think it may be just a symptom of running too many tests without knowing what they're doing. I could be wrong. Anyone have any experience with that?
I agree with you, Joe. Targeted testing, making sure that you're not running the entire test suite for every single build, definitely helps. We've tried that, and that's working well.
And also, we need to do classification, right? So you cannot just keep running 10,000 test cases per build, right? So you have to have a smoke suite. You have the golden sanity. You have regression suite that will run every night, but then partial testing will run every single PR March, right? Yeah. So if you don't do classification, then it's wasted of effort, I would say.
Only one thing is that let's make sure that is part of your CI/CD pipeline.
Of course.
Because when it fails, everybody gets attention.
Yeah. So to get to the heart of, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to add, I think your first comment nailed a lot of this when you started talking about naming and test case management. I actually had a conversation with lunch about this. So test case management isn't part of everything at the beginning. It's hard to be successful later. You actually have to be thinking about how you're naming your tests, how you're managing them, how you're grouping them. All these things you're talking about early on in the process before it becomes a problem. If it becomes a problem, you're already behind the eight ball on the screen.
Yeah, and the problem that I think John, I know John, we work together, and so one of the problems that he works on solving is the reproducibility problem. So his solution for a lot of this is mocking, and that's not always something you have control over, because sometimes the real complexity you have with services is even, and microservices are worse on this, is that they're so tightly coupled. You've got dozens of services that all depend strongly on each other, and you can't always mock them out. And a change in one can ripple across it. So it's actually the maintenance problem is the primary problem that you need to solve in automation. And how do you solve the problem of maintaining the tests as they break and as the APIs change? I could do a lot better on that. And that's one of the challenges. We have, especially for some of our larger projects, it's difficult to keep them on green. And so what we've been doing is we'll do scheduled code reviews on it. We'll have bug bash times to go through and identify the problem tests and work on that. And so polling helps a little bit for eventual consistency, but you need to spend time of identifying the failing tests. And there's also not a lot of good tools out there for doing analysis on long-term failed tests. We don't have tools as standalone products to help with that.
I think that's a gap. I think tools like reportportal.io is great because it helps you triage. So when you come in, you have 1,000 tests, but 700 of them all are due to one failure.
Yeah,
helps you kind of.
You're talking about Report Portal?
Report Portal.
Yeah, but Report Portal doesn't know what a branch is. So
right. Well, there's other solutions out there too, but that's a good point.
Yeah, if you don't know what an org, a repo, and a branch is, then I can't use it because I have to. Anytime I have to click a button, it's useless to me for automation.
So you brought up. Go ahead.
I can up a question. I'm curious what some of the issues you ran into with mocking were. Why?
Well, it's just a challenge because a lot of times you're dealing with stateful behavior in a database. And so, I can't spin up a database every time. It's hard. If I've got to spin up a Postgres database in order to run the service, it can be difficult. It's the stateful behavior of the service under test. And so, because you're solving separate problems. One is there's build acceptance tests. If I'm testing the service under test, and then there's integration API tests, which is, can I ship this to prod without breaking something? And build acceptance tests or mocks aren't always going to give you that confidence. I can have confidence that my service didn't change, but I don't know if the service I depend on is still working. And so API tests are going to give you the highest degree of confidence, but they're also the slowest and the most flaky next to UI testing.
Has anyone ever used something like test container that helps you spin that up like different services to go with that particular test?
You can, but you still need to know the full database on it. And so there's a lot of overhead for doing that.
Yeah. Great. So you did mention microservices. I know that's obviously a growing trend. I think it also may help you to minimize the amount of tests or flaky tests usually you have to do in UI. So anyone have experience with going from UI to API testing? Anthony, you're looking at me pretty good. So.
Well, I've been able to avoid UI testing for the vast majority of my career, aside from manually looking at a page occasionally.
Right.
So I don't think I have too many horror stories in terms of UI testing, other than just I've heard it's awful at times.
Prashant's smiling. So you're
I was just going to say, I was chatting with my friend here.
Yeah, I don't think it's a horror story, but I think it's just an approach, right? I think so. I can say about one of the teams that I work with is they have around 1,000 test cases total. Out of them, 600 probably are on API test, and rest of them are UI test. And the UI test, so as she was mentioning that we have the golden sanity, we have smoke, so we have those which should always pass, right? Those are there, those are our golden test cases. So apart from those, when we run the regression, and we do find there's a flakiness, it's not always about test itself, it's just about the network communication. There are a lot of other brittle factors that goes into UI, and that's the reason we we mostly depend on API. If API testing is great, like all of them are passing, we have better confidence in UI, because the amount of changes UI, it depends on obviously how many changes UI has been doing. If UI has been not making so many changes, it's more of just a backend changes, then you can, it's every situation based. But if the UI has a lot of changes, then yes, you'll have to probably regress those more and figure out how to solve that. Because one of the things that we started doing is standardizing a lot of those UI tests, so that we can take a page object model type of situation where for per page we have these element locators, because those are the most of them they fail quickly, right? And we started standardization where every page has separate like a PO file or page object file with all the elements, so it's easy to make changes when there's a change.
But don't you think that if only test automation or QA team is approaching that, it's not good enough, right? Because UI development have to follow their best practices. So if there is a page element or XPath or any object naming convention change or anything like that, if QA or test automation framework doesn't let, like previously told, or have a notification, then obviously your 60% test will fail, and then Q will be the blame for, right? But it has to be hand in hand that when UI developer developing their web application, they have the best practice that if something change in this particular sprint or quarter, these are the list of things will change, and QA get notification early on, then we work together and make it happen, and test are less flakier.
Exactly. And that's the reason we have now added all the automation testers as part of the pull request when the UI developer is making changes. Even though they may not understand everything, but at least they have an idea. If element, something is changing, at least they have an idea. So that helps in understanding, okay, hey, because ideally, developer should be telling, okay, I'm changing this element, okay, communicate, right? But okay, not every developer is a great developer, so it depends on that, right? I think we have misses, and that's how we find out if there are any misses.
One thing to add to that is one thing that we started doing, we started adding data attributes to the code so that we have this agreement with the developers that no matter what changes you want to do, don't change the data attributes because our tests are based on that. So that way there's a lot of, we've kind of stopped going back and making changes to the tests because of these small changes that's been happening.
Sometimes that is not possible from development side. For example, if you are a growing application, right, you have 10 pages right now. In quarter or two, it will be 25 pages. It's not always possible to keep your data attribute. Then it's a growing pain. So you have to be flexible as well as follow the best practice.
I agree, because there are situations where we have to go back and, kind of change how this component is working. Those are times where we have to kind of communicate. Hey, these tests are going to fail because of these things. So that's when we have to communicate. But for the most part, at least when you're in maintenance mode, that works.
When it comes to UI testing, it's been my experience that UI testing is the best time to mock the back end. And I've seen full suites that run in seconds because you're mocking it. And so is that your experience? Because I don't do a lot of AI testing. I do almost entirely API testing, but I've seen UI testing done really effectively with mocks. And so are there circumstances where you think it doesn't make sense to mock the back end for UI testing?
A lot of time it doesn't make sense to mock the data when you are solely thinking about UI perspective, right? So how our organization work is API is totally API testing. So end-to-end all API, how it's connecting with each and every page or interaction. So we are dealing with API totally differently. And then UI, right? So in UI, we see the behavior-based use case. And then if we need to create mock the data, for example, I have a list of devices. So then we have to mock the data, right? Or do some specific attribute change while we are running the test cases. For example, I changed the profile in that particular device.
So why wouldn't it work? I'm still a little confused. Like I'm not
No. I said maybe you don't need to mock up when you are using only the UI sort of test cases.
Yeah.
But when it's hybrid, like you have to get the data from the database or mock services.
So
then you need it.
It's more important to like the atomic test type of thing than mocking, I think, with UI, because a lot of times, I think, I forget who mentioned it, but a lot of test cases get written with a lot of steps, because when you run it manually, it makes sense, because, I'm already here on this page, I've already done all this work to get there, I might as well just check this while I'm here.
Yeah.
So there's a tendency to write test cases like that, and then when they get, passed on for automation, those don't necessarily make good automation candidates. If you have like lightweight tests that are atomic, where you're only checking like very specific things, and you have them named correctly to your point, then you don't have as many issues with UI testing.
I think Greg wants to jump in really quick.
So from a mocking standpoint, it helps you verify the UI works, but typically UI test that's failing from the UI is not the part of having the data. It's something that underneath that you need to actually explore. So if you mock everything out, you're actually pushing issues into production that you would have never caught if you was mocking out the whole front. So it really just depends where you want to mock that in various states.
Because my belief, and like I would love for someone to correct me on it, but my belief is that if you have a core set of API tests that are testing your happy path, then you can mock nearly 100% of your UI.
You can definitely mock most of the UI, but I think one of the things you'll see is that it could be an actual issue between like React and Redux.
Got it.
And stuff like that. And you can mock that out, but then it could also be that the API served the data really quickly, but then the UI actually had the, like React has a rendering issue, and you're surfacing that up a little bit from that standpoint.
Okay.
Can't your mocking tool also simulate those things?
You could.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many layers when you start seeing it. When a UI test fails, there's so many layers underneath it that it could cause that UI test to fail. It's not maybe the data itself. It could be some other thing.
Yeah, and so that's why they'll just typically retry on it. I get it. I follow. Thank you.
Sorry.
So, comments made earlier, what I'm hearing sounds a lot like the QA team is reactionary. The developers made this change, messed up an element ID, messed up an element attribute, and so the QA team has to fix it. Why is there not more effort being placed on working with developers to say, here's how the tests run, can you please do X, Y, and Z. You add the following data attributes yourself. Can you make an effort to read the tests and understand how they work? Can you take accountability when tests break? Why are we not doing that more instead of more of this reactionary, if something broke, QA team needs to fix it?
Right. So what I was saying was that was more of a past. The way we have been doing is that whenever there are major feature changes in UI, right? So obviously developer is working in the branch, right, where he's making a code changes. So we are making sure that, okay, he has an ability to run the targeted UI automation test on his feature branch, because we can deploy that easily on some environment, and we can run the UI automation against that, and at least find out if there are, because here's the thing, right? We can completely depend on developer to make sure that he's communicating exactly what changes he's making, and there are times where it doesn't happen, right? And that's where if a developer gets at least an ability to execute the automation test, right? He has a complete control over that. Okay, hey, the test is not running. Let's work together and find out why is it not working, because I made changes here. Let's figure it out. So those has been the changes, the learnings that we had, where and that's the reason I said, right, for pull requests, whenever there is a UI big changes, I think the QA works very closely with the developer, and we test the feature branch. We make sure that the changes that he's made are already taken care. We may not run the complete regression. Okay, that may not happen, but at least the targeted test, we will be doing that. One thing I wanted to just add, I forgot to add about the best practices, right? One of the things that we started doing is that we also applied CI for test automation code itself. So that means that when the test automation is basically versioned, the test automation code repository itself is versioned, itself is tested with the golden test cases, making sure that the test that modified, right, at least it did not break the golden test cases, because that's one of the stability that we want to make, and that's how we could make it. So.
You have a question?
Sorry,
Yeah, I just want to add on the fact that most of the time manual tests are translated into UI tests. And in my experience, that's a big mistake, because we have like a big series of UI tests. But the biggest challenge already, you guys talking about it, is changing mindset instead of translating that into UI tests directly. We need to ship that down and ship platform to try to build upon different small tests into it and separate that in a way that works, and that's a big challenge. But the question I have is a little bit on when you are changing into automation and defining strategy and doing all of that, what are the measurements of success that you guys look at? So because sometimes it's the return of investment, because I say to my company, I'm going to invest in automation. They say, yes. How successful? How do you guys measure it?
It's a challenge because, if I hire a security guard and nobody ever breaks a window, people are going to be inclined to say, we don't need this guy, right? And if you're doing your job as a QA engineer, a lot of times you're looking, well, we don't really need this guy. Production's perfect. But one thing that's helped me is having an answer when something does go wrong, like what the cost of that was. And I will admit, I still, even though I ask questions, I still really have no idea. I could tell you how many users were impacted, but one thing that opened my eyes, I was having drinks one day after work with a friend on the business side of the house. And he's like, man, remember that incident last month? He's like, we lost like a small little customer. That guy was friends with like a big whale. And now they're ticked off at us too. And it was, how do you put monetary value on that? But I think it's having answers, at least the start to an answer to those sorts of questions as ammunition to prove your worth, so to speak. That's how you demonstrate the value. So I think, hey, if we're going to automate things, like you don't want to, speed to production's great, but really have a conversation with your business partners and see what people are saying, customers are saying about your product. If they think it's really good and they used to think it was okay, then that's an indication that a lot of things are going right, and probably automation is playing into that. And if you're experiencing a spike in production incidents, then whoopee-doo if you automated everything. Like, you're providing more garbage to your customers than you were before. You should rethink what you're doing. And I don't have any great examples off the top of my head. Every company's different, right? Everyone's got a different experience with that. But I think it is staying connected to your business partners and seeing what your actual customers are saying and using that as a gauge as to whether or not you, on the development side of the house, are doing a good job delivering quality products.
Sneha, you want to say something?
Yes. So for me, like for example, I work in an e-learning company, and what matters to me in my product is trying to make sure that the product is learnable, right? And so my priorities are different from maybe some other product that someone else is trying to test. So I think it's more approaching from what is it that matters to you. Like for me, we have a lot of interactive elements. We have media, we have audio, we have video, we have assessments and things like that that we need to test. And another thing that's very important to us as a product, as a QA team to test is how accessible the course is, because we want every student to be able to use it, and localization testing and multi-browser testing. So it really depends. The strategy would depend on what is it that matters to you. And we started with literally no automation. It was all manual testing. So for me, my first phase was to just get some functional testing in. And then the next stage was adding accessibility automation to it, and just going stage by stage, and then slowly defining goals and adding on to it and building. So that is my, strategy that I would base it on.
But I think ROI is important if you want to know immediate result, right? You have to figure out what your team needs and define the metrics, right? Like automation found bug, how many feature bug you find by your automation, right? Otherwise, there is no way you know that your automation is doing good or not, right? So that could be one of the metrics that.
Yeah, you can write a dashboard with Jira tickets and measure P0s, and that's totally fine and great. What I think most developer teams will care most about is confidence, that they can ship code without breaking things. And that confidence, it's hard to know about the bugs you haven't encountered yet. So it's really, I think that some bugs are going to slip through. That's going to happen. Not all test plans are going to be perfect. But the confidence that you want to be able to sell people on is that we're not going to make the same mistake twice. And if you don't have a process in place where when you have an escape and you find the root cause, you need to make sure that you're going to have a really high degree of confidence that functionality is going to be there. And I would dare you to try refactoring a monolith. Try refactoring a monolith payment system without API testing, because I've been a part of that, and I can tell you, I can't count the number of bugs that have been caught because of API testing. I literally can't count it. There's so many that have happened at every stage of development that you get with API testing, and there have been so many more false positives in that process. But that's the price of confidence.
And the way every organization has moved to Agile, right, where we have sprints, and so a lot of time we don't even open the bugs because we are working with the developer to right there to say, hey, this is failing, let's fix it quickly, right? So it sometimes is not even about that. The other piece that one started helping slowly is, and it's still difficult to do, it's that takes time, is performance testing. I think the continuous performance testing is something we need to adopt so that we don't have to do 1,000 or 1,000,000 users from day one, right? But at least something so that, because that's where the application break most of the time. There are two things. One is the functional, which you figure out, okay, where the workflow is correct and not. But the other thing is, how does it perform in production? Hopefully we don't find it in the production, we find it before that. Right.
Do you use performance testing as promotional gating criteria? So when you're writing your Gatling scenario or something, you're saying, I'm expecting that the 50% or the 95% is below this?
So we would like to. Yeah. It's not automated gating factor. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
It's a manual gating factor.
Because I've used like Gatling tests before, like when we're switching data centers, and we were able to use that to like pinpoint specific API calls that were round tripping, for example, when we did the data center switch. But it's really hard to sort of like, fail on performance. It's hard to know like how slow is too slow.
Correct. And that's where, if you start performance testing from the beginning, at least we have some benchmark. Okay, hey, we were taking 10 seconds. Now we are actually at 7 seconds, much better. And the 7 second became, again 11, 12 seconds. Something is going wrong. Let's figure it out. If we cannot figure out, we cannot we still want to release. It's okay maybe to release but create the bug. Make sure there is an action item attached to it.
One of the things I want to build is I want to learn the Datadog API and be able to query services on the 95th percentile and stuff and send out automated alerts that this service has gotten slower, fix it. That's what I think would be the cool proactive thing is that's a no code solution that you could actually solve on performance. Because I think, in my experience, performance testing is really easy to do for benchmarking, but it's really hard to know when you should fail it.
Right. Prashant, what are you using for performance testing? I'm just curious.
So we are using Karate with Gatling. Because it's easy to, because use functional test as a performance test. I don't have to write a separate test. It's just calling a functional test. Whatever workflow I want.
That's a trend I've been seeing more of. You're leveraging functional tests for performance and security. Is anyone else doing performance testing or security testing? Need some help there.
And that's one of the challenges we've had is when I compare the APM data to the Karate data, there's not, we're not yet at the point of a big value add. And so I think there's opportunities to explore to add more value there.
Where are you guys doing performance testing? Do you have a standalone environment?
We have monitors on our agents for the web service. And so when you're using the APM monitor, it's already giving you the statistics on your request response time for aggregated over a period of time because you're getting it from Datadog or whatever APM you're using. And so that's, if you're using it for benchmark testing, it makes sense. But if you, let's say you have something that's performance sensitive, then you can really say, if I'm over 100 milliseconds, then this thing should fail. And that makes sense. But most things aren't in that category.
The back corner?
Yeah, so I just had a question, right? So I've been around for a bit, and Selenium was going to solve our problems with UI testing, and then Cypress is going to solve our problems because it's that much easier, right? And now I feel like it's a little cyclical in the sense that we're kind of going backwards. It's not backwards, but we're moving forward. We got to get released faster. So I'm curious if anybody has actually made an active effort to start, when those UI tests fail, to really start looking at the value of that test and say, do we really need this? And is it covered with API? And start lowering our UI test coverage, and maybe just to the React example was perfect, right? Does it load? Can I click? But do I really have to go through this ridiculous scenario through the UI? Is it acceptable to go through the just do everything API and just do basic sanity UI testing? Is anybody making an active effort?
Last week I saw someone using GUI automation to hit the Swagger page to call the API.
Try it now.
So I would just add one point to that, right? I think categorizing the UI test really makes exactly what you're saying, right? We have to continuously analyze or make sure that does it really make sense to run this every time, or this should be part of big regression? Should this be part of small regression? I think those, and I think one of the things that Karate helps is we can add as many tags we want so that we can make a part of that group so that it's easy to say, okay, hey, this time I want to run all small regression or mini regression. So.
Yes, I should probably declare myself I'm from one of these UI automation vendors, but my question is more in line of prior to that I was a business architect, and this conversation in this room and saying, let's skip the whole UI bit because it's only the user doing that, and let's get the APIs in there and everything's going to work out great because all the building blocks checks out. And from an end acceptance perspective, the number of times we've been in conversations where around the table, yeah, it works here. The only problem is it doesn't pass the test. The application ends up not working, and it becomes a conversation. Yeah, it's also the low performance thing or the thing over in the back. Super unproductive. So to me, it's surprising to hear this disqualification of UI testing because that's that's where all things meet up. That's where it's supposed to work. I get that it's difficult to do. The point of it being brittle is valid. At least to get stable is difficult. But to me, there's no other way. How do you want to address the end user experience product without when at the same time sort of discontinuing the whole UI testing conversation? I'm curious about that. What do you think?
I don't think I'm discontinuing. What I'm saying is that I think a lot of the confidence can come from API testing if there are not that many UI changes. When there are massive UI changes, yes, you'll have to depend on UI testing, right? It's just that how many times that whole page is going to change? Very few times, right? You're going to change probably one component. Now, nowadays, a lot of applications are single page applications. So only one component is changing. So it's easy to target basically only those UI tests which you know that you have made changes. I think that making sure that we do targeted tests makes a life easier. Because if you start doing everything every time, it's going to be painful.
Absolutely.
So what percentage, like in your experience, because and I'll come out and say I'm a back-end engineer, so my back-end is APIs. I talk to APIs. So, I've got a golden hammer, so that's fine. So how would you divide it? Because in my experience, there's a lot of unit tests, there's a lot of API tests. What percentage of tests do you think need to be UI tests?
Well, I think that the conversation is really, the point making back, right? It's so brittle, it breaks all the time. Why would we do it?
Yeah.
So, and that's a fair point. If we can't get past that, then it turns directly entirely in the other direction in terms of let's focus testing over there.
In fairness, you can make the same argument on API tests are brittle too. So it's just a continuum on it. But what's your experience when you're working with companies? What percentage of tests do you think they should be doing at the UI level? What percent at the API level? Just ballpark.
Yeah, some of the clients that we're working with, it's leaning towards 60-40 on the UI side. Because they are, all the changes that they do underneath from the business processing perspective, which is at the end of the day what they want to validate, they can safeguard that using the GUI. And once they've got it going, it's a fast track to it. It's not eliminating API testing. It's kind of switching it around, saying, I'm not doing changes on the GUI side, so let's just stick to API. It's kind of the other way around.
But even the question is the balance between risk and value, right? What is if it's an internal tool, why do I have UI testing? Right? Obviously, if there's low risk, if there is a big UI break, right? But if we're talking about that's our main usage, all of our customers are using it, obviously we live with that. I just think it's just been that whole thing. Because we have these UI tests or these tools, let's just automate everything, right? Let's just do all the user scenarios, right? I think we did over there. There's so many times you have to go through 20 steps to get to a page. You're like, I'm already here. I'm just going to check all that stuff anyways, which has nothing to do with the flow. That's a whole different strategy. That's a whole different problem, right? But I think it relates.
I think the UI testing really depends on your application. So like Sneha, of course it's going to be very UI. It's going to be heavy UI, right? So it really depends on that, completely from that standpoint, right? So everybody's scenario is going to be a little different. And so when you're talking about brittle tests, there's a symptom there, and some of it could be you're running too many tests in parallel, and you're just tearing up the whole infrastructure. So maybe you need to get the cloud ops team involved to try to figure out what's going on there, add more pods and stuff like that. So there's a lot of that.
Chime in here. So I've done both UI tests and API tests. It is completely accepted to run API tests in isolation from the UI. But how many times do we run UI tests in isolation of the backend? And I think the issue here is that the user interface is its own product and deserves its own isolated testing. And people are generally not making the effort to test the UI in isolation from the backend because it's really, really hard to do that. But if we do that properly, if we test the UI in isolation from the backend, we can test each piece of the UI on its own and know that each piece of the UI works. Then these massive end-to-end tests where we're covering all aspects of the UI plus all aspects of the API are largely irrelevant. We can get rid of a lot of them and just have some general testing where, yes, the application loads, the application is talking to the UI or to the API correctly, and we're getting the data back that we need. And we don't need to test the whole UI with the whole backend. That becomes trivial because we know that the API works on its own, we know that the UI works on its own. The UI tests are still necessary though, because the UI is an integral part of the application, arguably the most important part of the application because it is what the customer sees. And it deserves its own testing.
Does anyone use visual validation to help with that? It sounds like a lot of these tests could be, I know Greg, you do video. Anything with visual validation, does that help with a lot of these issues and these issues?
Definitely helps. We use some tool. Can I mention tools? We use Apple tools for visual testing, and especially with courses, it helps a lot because we want to take a snapshot of it to see if anything changed. So we've definitely seen a lot of advantages of using visual testing. It's definitely an integral part of our testing pyramid.
So it's like you can run a lot of API tests, and if you're worried about the visual aspect of it, you can run.
You could just use visual testing. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the aspects that we are missing, and probably we are treating automation like a silver bullet, right? And sometimes it's not. We need also to take a step back and look at the strategy, right? And go to the testing principles like having component testing, integration testing, and then apply the strategy on what we want to do, right? Probably if you are developing a component which is business and API, right? Well, I need to test the API. Right. And in my integration, I test a small suite of regression with the UI. Right?
Absolutely. We probably should stop wrapping up.
I just wanted to mention I watched one of your prior shows on your channel, and Montebank was one of those solutions to testing UI without the backend. It's been a lifesaver.
Oh, really? You used it?
Oh,
awesome.
yeah.
Oh, good to know.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, so speaking of tools, I guess one last thing. This is the future of testing. Anyone have any new cool tools and techniques you recommend everyone maybe check out when they leave here? Let's start with
All right, I'll pitch myself. I'm working on an endpoint coverage for karate using the logs and Swagger on it. So I want to do more with Swagger on it. So Swagger Gem and karate is one of the things I'll be working with Karate Labs to make happen. I don't know when, but soon.
Oh, we're looking out for it. Sneha?
New tools. So I use Test Modeler for model-based testing. I would say it's definitely changed the way we test things with the courses. So I would say check it out.
I would just say just check it out Karate Labs first, right? If you haven't first, if you haven't at all. Right? If you have, I think one of the things that I'm looking into it more is distributed performance testing, because that's something is important also. So.
Can I give like a non-answer to that? Obviously, I'm a big fan of Karate Labs, but I would say more important than what tools you select, make sure that, as a quality engineer, you're really focused on customer value, technical risk, test complexity, and knowing who your customer is. And we got into a discussion earlier, what percentage would you think UI testing versus, there's no answer to that, right? It depends on, like some companies, it might be none at all, and others, it's if you have a spelling error on your homepage, you're going to lose millions of dollars because who's going to give you money for you can't even spell your own title right? So yes, I think it's whatever tool you want to use. There's plenty out there that are really, really good at what they do, but make sure that you understand what you need before you start shopping around for tools, so to speak.
Absolutely. Great advice. We'll leave up on that. I want to thank Karate for sponsoring us. Want to learn more about karate? We have a booth at booth 14. I'm actually going to have a champagne party from 5:30 to 6:30. You're all invited. I want to thank all the experts.